What's going on YouTube? It's jlmussi, and as promised, here's the second video that's documenting the build of my massive 3D printed apocalypse bust on my Raise 3D N2 Plus. This video will break down the design of the final 3D printed file for the torso, the actual printing, the sanding, gluing, priming, and everything in between. Now this video took a little bit longer than I originally wanted to. That was partly due to my printer actually breaking. Also that printing huge busts and prepping them and sanding them takes an extraordinary amount of time. Episode notes along with any links to any products used in this video will be in the description down below. So without any further ado, let's get on with the video. So I'm here in Zbrush and using a deformer. I'm just making small tweaks to the shape so it's a little bit more aesthetically pleasing once it's sitting on the base. So using these larger primitives along with light booleans and Zbrush, I'm able to pre-visualize how the cuts are actually going to be within the torso before I commit to those changes. So this light booleans feature was actually pretty useful when cutting up this torso. And once I'm happy with the cut, I'll go ahead and run the booleans, and now I'll have separate meshes. I created a simple volume with 12 by 12 by 24 divisions. Each division represents an inch within the printing volume on my Raise 3D N2 Plus. And that way I can ensure that each part that I'm slicing up will actually fit on my print bed and will be scaled properly. You'll see me adjust the volume to ensure that each piece that I'm cutting actually fits within my printing bed. With all the pieces cut up, it was time to make the registration keys. I took a small cylinder and I beveled both ends. And then I duplicated that mesh, and using the deformation palette, I did an inflate to basically create the negative boolean for this. And then that small offset will allow that the pieces would fit and I wouldn't have to do additional sanding. These registration keys are pretty important when you 3D print. Especially when it comes down to gluing. You don't want to put a bunch of glue down and have to guess where things align. So these will actually help snap the pieces exactly where they need to be and make my life a lot easier when it comes down to gluing. I took each individual cylinder, duplicated it, and placed them in the corners of my mesh and anywhere that the registration keys were to be created. Once I was happy with the placement, I then combined them all, ran a Boolean subtract operation, and thus created the registration keys for each of my 3D printed pieces. So I started printing the pieces about halfway through one of my larger torso pieces. About 70 hours in, my ribbon cable goes out. I had to call Raise 3D. They helped me identify the problem and they sent me a replacement cable. I had the piece in the bed. For me to properly reinstall the cable, I would have to dismantle the whole printer, thus me having to remove the print and scrapping it all together. So I pretty much just rigged it where I had the ribbon cable going through a bracket for the shelf, and I was able to finish the piece. Then after getting the piece done, I dismantled the whole printer and properly reinstalled the ribbon cable. Oh, the joys of 3D printing. The largest torso piece, the one of the trap on the right hand side, actually failed. I basically was running low on filament and I thought I could make it through the night, but boy did I think wrong, because I wake up and just by a couple layer lines I missed it, so the filament ran out and there was a small gap, thus I had to scrap that piece entirely altogether, which kind of sucked because I was already at ridiculous printing times with the other pieces. Total print time for the 7 pieces, including that failed print, ran about 500 hours, and I used almost 5 kilograms of Solutech PLA, which did a pretty good job overall. Now, as far as the quality, I did have some issues on the slope pieces. First of all, they had to have a lot of support underneath to support just that arch. And secondly, just seems that gravity and FDM printers really don't mix well. So I had a little bit of warping as well. I could have sliced the model a little bit differently to basically have the slopes upside down, which worked better for some areas. But already at 7 pieces, I decided to basically roll the dice and try my hand at cleaning up the prints with sanding and post-processing the pieces. So I did quite a bit of research to figure out which adhesive worked best with PLA. And I decided to test 3 of the more popular ones, which are Goop, regular super glue, and Instacure. I glued 3 different test prints using each different product, let it sit for a couple of days, and then I went to go ahead and remove it. The one that performed the worst was the Goop, followed by the super glue, which did an okay job. And then the Instacure actually bonded the best out of 3 products. And that's the one that I stuck with for the remainder of the project. It was time to sand, and boy did I have to sand. That was gonna be the theme of this torso piece, sanding. Did I say sanding? Yes, I did. So I started with 60 to 120 grit, and I started to basically sand and remove most of the visible layer lines. I used a bench vise to help me secure some of the odd-shaped pieces, which would slide around in my hand. So having that vise definitely helped out. And I also roughed up between the joints, the areas that were going to be glued together. I roughed those up so the bond would have something to actually adhere to a little bit better. With a damp rag, I cleaned up the areas that were going to be glued together. And then with my registration keys, I put each pin in, and I did a good test fit to make sure all the pieces fit together quite nicely. I applied plenty of glue to the areas that were going to be joined together, and then I put them in place and firmly held them together for a couple minutes. And then I let the parts just sit overnight for the glue to fully cure. After the glue had dried, I went into the seams and I applied JB plastic weld to fill in the gaps and give the piece some more strength. After the plastic weld started to harden, with a box cutter, I went and I scraped off the excess to make it easier to sand later down the road. I repeated the process of cleaning each piece, test fitting, gluing, and holding them in place until the glue dried, over and over and over for each piece until the torso was completed. So the thing about working with a large surface area in Instacure is that boy does it cure, and it cures quick. So I had a black cover, almost like a black cardboard piece that I was working on, and it became glued to the printed part. I had to pretty much go back and make sure it was clean before attaching the final 2 areas. So I put my registration keys as usual, added plenty of glue, and then I connected both pieces, thus finalizing the torso itself. I needed a makeshift base while I was working on the torso, so with my trusted calipers, I measured the opening of a 10-pound plate, and in Zbrush, using the Z modeler tool, I modeled a makeshift bracket that would connect the bottom of the torso with the registration keys that I had created with the top of the 10-pound plate. With the torso fully assembled, it was time to bust out the Bondo and start smoothing out the arched areas. And this is where the printing quality was at its lowest, thus I had to do the most prep work. Now, breathing in Bondo is not something that you want to be exposed to long term, so I did have to invest in a 3M breathing mask to actually protect myself from the fumes. Now, this was the first time that I worked with Bondo, so it was a little bit of a learning curve to figure out the right ratio of the two-part component that Bondo comes with and allow myself enough working time with the material. But once I figured that out, it wasn't too bad. I let the Bondo dry overnight, and then I came back with 100 to 200 grit sandpaper, and I sanded it to a smooth finish. And I will say Bondo sands really, really nice. With the Bondo fully applied and sanded, it was time to move in with the filler primer. I applied thin coats evenly, and I allowed enough time for each coat to fully dry before coming in with the next one. Now, looking back at the project, I wish I would have spent more time sanding prior to doing the filler primer. I ended up using a lot of filler primer in hopes that the filler primer would do a lot of the smoothing work, but actually didn't. And essentially I had to sand off most of it and go back to the bare PLA and do most of the sanding work again. I actually ended up using about 3 cans of this just on the torso itself. So this was definitely a learning experience, and next time I will definitely do a lot more sanding before I move on to the filler primer. I did some wet sanding on the piece, ranging from 300 to 400 grit sandpaper, and after that it was time to move in for the final layers of primer. I went with an automotive primer for the first 2 layers, and I did sanding in between, ranging from 6 to 1,000 grit. And for the final layer, I went with Tamiya's fine surface primer, which actually just sprays on real smooth and doesn't need any additional sanding. Now, through the whole process of sanding, priming, sanding, and priming, I found out about the importance of good lighting. When I first started, I didn't really have good lighting in my workshop, and then you'll see towards the end of the video that I did upgrade to some LED architect lights, which really helped me spot the imperfections and really allowed me to tackle the problem areas with precision and get really good progress done. The last step was to remove the masking tape that I placed on the base of the neck, and I chose to mask off the base of the neck because I didn't want the ridges that I had to be filled in with the filler primer. This will also make my life easier when joining the top head and having just a clean PLA base to just glue and work off. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the look of a man that does not like what he sees under the masking tape. Apparently, somehow, the base of the neck cracked a bit. So, I'm not going to tell you what's going on through my mind right now, but most of the words rhyme with luck. I'm not really worried about it. I know that I'll be able to fill it, sand it, prime it, and it'll be a smooth finish. So, it won't really be noticeable in the final product. So after a ridiculous number of hours printing, sanding, gluing, sanding, priming, and did I say sanding? Yes, lots of sanding. I finally got the surface finish that I wanted, and I'm super excited about how the torso turned out. It was definitely a great learning experience, and I have a lot more confidence in my prop building going forward and getting an extra smooth finish. Now that I'm finally done with the torso, it's time to relax, grab a drink or a and then think about creating, printing, and prepping the neck armor for the torso. So make sure that you subscribe to my channel, turn on the notifications icon, and I also do the whole social media thing. So if you're on any of these platforms and want to keep up with these updates for the project, make sure to follow me on those as well. Appreciate your time. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.